a woman who had been in jail near the Mexico-United States border, told us this.
We were held with another woman who was coughing so badly that she threw up violently over and over. The others in the cell called for help, and an officer came over and said, "Que se muera, let her die."
Here's a 16-year-old boy under the same circumstances.
They treated me like a dog. They asked if I wanted water, but when I responded yes, they wouldn't give me any.
No, these aren't Americans in a Mexican jail. These are Mexican nationals being held in a detention facility of the United States Government Border Patrol. These stories were collected by volunteers of the humanitarian organization No More Deaths. No More Deaths is based in Tucson, Arizona, with the mission of ending death and suffering on the U.S.-Mexico border through the use of civil initiative. The conviction that persons of conscience must work openly and in community to uphold fundamental human rights. They work in a number of different ways to achieve these ends, but this presentation will focus upon their efforts to document the abuse by U.S. government agencies of migrants and others caught in the war zone conditions along the border, and to advocate for changes in agency policies. But first, some background information. The Sonoran Desert stretches westward and southward from Tucson, 120,000 square miles in extent. It covers large portions of Arizona, California, and the northern Mexican states of Sonora, Baja California, and Baja California Sur. The U.S.-Mexico border runs right through the middle. It is a hostile and dangerous place for people on foot traveling long distances, but nevertheless migrants come across the border through the Sonoran Desert in large numbers. We don't know how many for sure, and the number has declined in recent years because of the economic situation in the United States. But one indicator is these recent statistics of apprehensions by the Border Patrol. They have previously estimated that they only apprehend about 1 in 4 of the border crossers. The crossers are driven by economic necessity. Since the 1980s, neoliberal policies of the World Bank, the IMF, and the United States have forced the dismantling of many of the economic protections for Mexican and Central American agriculture and industry. For example, under NAFTA, implemented in 1993, Mexico was forced to allow duty-free corn imports from the United States. Thereafter, during NAFTA's first 7 years, those corn imports increased an astounding 18-fold. Tens of thousands of Mexican farmers, stripped of their subsidies and unable to compete with U.S. corn prices, were driven off their land. Once able to feed their families, they must now find cash to buy food in spite of limited income opportunities. When stopgap efforts to earn some money fail, these are the people who go north, crossing the border into the United States, likely facing several days of walking through hostile country while attempting at the same time to evade the U.S. Border Patrol. Following the implementation of NAFTA, the U.S. government embarked on what has become a tenfold increase in public resources devoted to enforcing the very limited quotas for border crossing. Of special interest to us is the pattern of that enforcement. That pattern was most prominently set by Operation Gatekeeper, announced in 1994 by then Attorney General Janet Reno, which fortified the westernmost 5 miles of the border near San Diego with a formidable fence and increased staffing. Since then, the Border Patrol has increasingly fortified major roads and population areas, making it difficult for migrants to pass through those areas and funneling them to the more remote, more dangerous part of the border. That's why so many people end up walking through the Sonoran Desert, and too often dying there. Each red dot on this map represents the death of one or more immigrants, as reported by the Border Patrol during an 8-year period. We know that some deaths go unreported, and we suspect that a large number go entirely undiscovered by anyone. In October 2003, frustrated by the continuing level of deaths in the desert, religious leaders in Tucson met to consider possible solutions. One outcome was the formation of No More Deaths in 2004 to provide food, water, and medical assistance to migrants passing through the desert, to monitor U.S. government operations on the border, and to work to change U.S. policy that creates the crisis atmosphere on the border. Large numbers of volunteers participate in these programs, and camps are established in the desert to provide assistance, outreach, and monitoring. Many migrants cross more than once in increasingly compromised health, raising the likelihood of injury and death. So No More Deaths partnered with cross-border faith communities, agencies, and humanitarian groups to establish stations on the Mexican side of the border to give immediate aid to deportees. The first two were set up in Nogales and Agua Prieta in 2006, with a third in 2008 in Naco. In the first 18 months of operation, volunteers saw more than 200,000 people who were dumped off by U.S. Homeland Security and forced to walk across the border. Volunteers also began listening to the deportees' stories, and that was the beginning of abuse documentation. Here is Marieta Valle, who heard hundreds of those stories.
In the summer of '06, we were not expecting to publish a report. We were not expecting to do a huge human rights documentation project. We knew that we wanted to meet people's needs, whatever those were, when they came to us, and we found out that there are huge abuses going on in Border Patrol custody. It became very clear quite quickly that we have to do something with this. Do people know that this is going on? And this is the largest law enforcement agency in the country.
The Abuse Documentation Project collected their experience in a report published in 2008 entitled Crossing the Line. The report's findings were buttressed by an appendix of 345 testimonies drawn from thousands of interviews at the 3 deportee aid stations. The Border Patrol's failure to respect basic human dignity of the migrants is reflected throughout. Here's an example from one of the interviews. Alfonso, aged 27, and Jorge, aged 34, witnessed an agent kick one man's legs apart so roughly that his pants ripped. When a woman said, "How can you treat us like that? We're not from the streets," an agent said, "You're a piece of shit." Another agent told them, "The next time you run, we'll kick your butts and leave you here in the desert." The agents threw away all of their food and gave their fruit to Border Patrol horses. Recommendations in Crossing the Line cluster around 7 specific issues. In many cases, Border Patrol agents are refusing ordinary aid owed to any distressed prisoner, the same aid that No More Deaths volunteers are working to provide in the desert and at aid stations. From the interviews, we learned that the Border Patrol has inadequate amounts of drinking water for prisoners. Their methods of distributing it are unsanitary, they deny it, and they do not take into account individuals with particular problems like kidney damage. Interviewers frequently heard of agents throwing away migrants' food. In processing centers, requests for sufficient food, even from children and pregnant women, are dismissed. Systematic denial of food exacerbates all the other problems that are common among migrants. A No More Deaths volunteer interviewed this 41-year-old migrant in Nogales on the Mexican side of the border just after he was deported. He had lived and worked for 14 years undocumented in California before returning to Mexico. He was apprehended as he made his way back north, walking through the desert in an attempt to return to his home in the United States.
Dos noches y un día. Se me hincharon muy feo los pies, se ampollaron. Ya no teníamos comida para comer, se nos acabó el agua. Ya no aguantaba caminar, a correr, pues caí al suelo. Ya no me quise mover, pues ya no aguantaba caminar, los pies ya no los sentía. Sí, me lastimé los pies.
¿Verdad? ¿Puede mostrar?
Me corté la frente.
¿Y en esta parte también?
Sí, también aquí. Todo casi. Un día y una noche en la cárcel. Hay veces que le dan de comer a uno y hay veces que no. No me dieron de beber, nomás puro juguito chiquitito, nada más. Eso no estoy tan bueno, la salud, me rayé, me corrí. Luego esta parte se me hinchó donde pegué en un árbol, en un palo.
Y cuando entraste ya en la cárcel, ¿te llevaron y te atendieron con atención médica?
No,
No.
no me atendieron.
Ni te ofrecieron.
No, ni me ofrecieron.
No. ¿Y pediste algo? Claro,
Pues sí,
claro que vieron, ¿no? La cara.
Sí, vieron la cara que estaba lastimado, pero nada más risa les dio la migra.
Cuando entraste en la cárcel, allá te dieron acceso a un teléfono para llamar a la familia, un abogado, consulado.
A ninguno.
Ninguno.
A nadie le ofrecen teléfono, a nadie se le ofrece nada. La cárcel, por lo más lo que pasa uno es hambre.
Sí.
Es hambre en la cárcel. Tenemos que sufrir mucho para querer pasar la raya.
While immigrants were in custody, their blisters covering entire soles of feet have gone untreated and become infected. Medication for conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure are confiscated and not returned. Open wounds, broken bones, and heat stroke have gone untreated before deportation. And even those few who have been hospitalized are repeatedly observed by volunteers being deported wearing only their hospital gowns. At processing centers, interviewees reported holding cells kept at extreme temperatures, blankets filthy or denied altogether, prisoners forced to sleep on overcrowded floors. Migrants are verbally and physically abused and are not informed of their right to legal counsel or to contact their consulate. They are coerced into signing forms that they do not understand. Here's an example in June 2010 of an interview with Gerardo, age 47, from Nayarit, Mexico. His feet were severely blistered and were being treated by a volunteer EMT during the interview. He was detained for 2 days at a Border Patrol detention center near Y, Arizona, after walking through the desert for 3 days. At the detention center, agents went through his belongings and those of others and threw away identifications, cell phones, and lists of phone numbers. Gerardo requested medical treatment for his feet, but was only told later. He never received any care. Songs called Migra Corridos, morbid tales of death in the desert, were played over the loudspeakers 24 hours a day at high volume. Every 2 hours, guards would come in shouting at the detainees and requiring them to line up for inspection. These measures prevented the detainees from sleeping, and Gerardo regarded them as forms of psychological torture. He reported substandard conditions that included inadequate food, overcrowding, and excessive cold. Transportation is done not only in the vehicles of the Border Patrol, but also in the buses of the Wackenhut Corporation, a private security firm under contract to Homeland Security to transport prisoners and deportees. Reports include lack of seat belts, agents driving at high speed over rough terrain carrying shackled prisoners, hazardous overcrowding, vehicles kept at extreme high or low temperatures. In one example, a group of 31 men and 4 women were deported at the Nogales port of entry. They reported spending several hours in Border Patrol custody where they did not receive food or water, They were also forced to spend hours in a 108-degree Border Patrol vehicle